Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come by. So the session obviously just started. Monday afternoon, everybody came back at 2 o'clock for the 2016 legislative session. This year, we're mainly going to be dealing with budget issues. The budget has been an issue in Kansas for the last 5 or 6 years, not surprisingly. We are continuing to have budget deficits. You read a lot in the media about what's going on with the budget. Sometimes what you read in the media is a little bit overhyped. Sometimes it's accurate. But really, when we look at what's happening with the budget, we're looking at an imbalance of revenues and spending. Just as with your personal household budgets, just happens across the United States everywhere. Sometimes spending exceeds revenues. What happens basically in Kansas, we set our budgets in a somewhat unique way. We basically say we're going to estimate how much money we're going to take in next year. It's called the Consensus Revenue Estimates. It's basically a group of economists from the four major state universities. They get together, they sit in a room in Topeka for an entire day. They look at the economic trends that are happening in the state, what's happening with agriculture, what's happening with manufacturing, what's going on in the real estate market, and they come up with a number. They say in 2016, we anticipate we're going to have X number of revenue come into the state, this much revenue come in. The problem with those revenue estimates is they're extremely inaccurate. You can imagine when you have people sitting in a room trying to guess how much money is going to be collected in tax revenue the next year, it's not always accurate. This year we were off again on revenue estimates fairly significantly. We adopted a budget last session that was supposed to have an ending balance this year, a bare bones ending balance of about $25 million. At this point, we anticipate we're going to have to cut more just to get out of this fiscal year. And next year we're looking, so the fiscal year that starts on July 1st, which is the 2017 fiscal year, right now we're looking at a $170 million deficit, roughly. Put that in perspective, that's out of a $13.2 billion budget. Of that, about $6.5 billion comes from the state general fund. The other $6.6 billion comes from the federal government. That's the all funds budget. So of a $6.5 billion state budget, we're off about $170 million at this point. The governor just released his budget today. It's about 600 pages. I reviewed it this morning, haven't got all the way through it. But what that budget essentially does is this year, the budget is not relying on tax increases to balance. Last year, you'll recall, we had to pass $400 million in tax increases just to balance the budget. We saw basically a 0.35 increase in the sales tax. We saw some changes to itemized deductions. We saw an increase in cigarette taxes, tobacco taxes, other items like that. That allowed us to bring in $400 million of additional revenue, which allowed us to balance the budget. This year, the governor is proposing to balance the budget with no new tax increases. However, what you will see is we are basically, accounting gimmicks is one word for it, we're basically transferring funds between state agencies. We have a comprehensive transportation program in Kansas. It's a 10-year plan. It was about $1.2 billion over 10 years, or actually about $2.3 billion. We're spending a significant amount of money to maintain, build roads, improve highways. In the legislature and in the media, that fund is normally referred to as the Bank of KDOT. It's happened every year since I've been around. My 10 years in the legislature, or being around the legislature, 10 years before that, routinely the state legislature sweeps money from that fund. Last year, I think we took in excess of $300 million from that fund. We're already budgeted to take a fairly significant amount of money from that fund next year. I think now in the governor's budget, they propose to take an additional $25 million. So that's kind of the framework for the session. You'll see, in my opinion, the legislature is extremely unlikely to pass tax increases again. This budget will be balanced with cuts and internal fund transfers, or sweeps, whatever you want to call them. So we will not see a tax increase this year. And in my opinion, it's really difficult to do. We have a sales tax already that is the 7th highest in the nation. When you factor in the state income, or state sales tax, and local units of government can top about 2% on top of that. And then you have special districts as well. You have transportation development districts, you have community improvement districts, you have all sorts of special taxing districts like star bonds. There are some units of government in Kansas where if you go purchase something, you're paying almost an 11% sales tax. So everybody acknowledges that our sales tax can't go any higher. That's the highest it can go. So if you take away sales tax, you're left with two income sources. You're left with income taxes and you're left with property taxes. Property taxes in Kansas are already some of the highest in the nation. According to who you listen to, there have been various studies. Kansas has the 15th highest tax rate in the nation on residential property. So if you own residential property in Kansas, on average, you pay the 15th highest tax rate in the nation. Commercial properties where it's even worse. Comparing us, if you live in a rural area in Kansas, you pay the highest effective tax rate in the nation on property. We are more than double the national average. In fact, we're about 270% higher than the national average. So if I live in Iola, Kansas, or Ozaukee, or some rural area in Kansas, I'm paying property taxes that are twice the national average. When you go to urban areas, we fare a little better. We're generally around 9th or 10th in the nation. That's not something I'm proud of. At least we're not worst. But we are 9th or 10th in the nation in urban commercial property taxes. So we do have a property tax problem in Kansas. So our message to the legislature is, of course, you can't raise property taxes. But when it comes down to it, then the only other source of revenue left for the state government is income taxes. We did significantly cut income taxes in 2012. We cut income taxes by about $1 billion a year in 2012. What you've seen since then in 2013, 2014, and then 2015 is we have been slowly raising taxes. So we cut taxes very deeply in 2012, and since that time we've been kind of raising them back up. Because everybody acknowledges we cut taxes too deeply. We shouldn't have cut taxes that much in 2012. So since that time we have had to raise taxes, but when you get in the context of the wider debate, some folks are basically saying we shouldn't have cut taxes, we should raise taxes to recoup those funds, and it's mostly in the context of public education. We have a pending court case in front of the Supreme Court. A group of school districts in the state have basically sued the state, and they've said we're not spending enough money on school finance. If the school districts win that case and the Supreme Court agrees with them, the state of Kansas will owe somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 to $650 million in additional funding to K through 12 education. To put that in the context, I said our budget is about $6.5 billion from the state general fund. That's 10% of our budget. Already, K through 12 is about half the budget. About 51% of every state tax dollar goes to K through 12 education. Another 10% goes to higher ed. That's about 61%. That's about 20 to 25% goes to Medicaid. If you cut Medicaid, which is social services to working poor folks, you lose $2 of federal money for every $1 of state money you cut. So you can't cut that. So you're really left with 15% of the budget that doesn't go to K through 12, higher ed, or Medicaid. Then if you really want to dig in deeper, you have corrections and prisons, and you have state troopers, you have law enforcement. That's another significant part of the budget you can't cut, or you have to close prisons and let people out of prison. So if we're going to try to finance the court ruling just through budget cuts and not additional tax revenues, you would basically have to eliminate every other government agency, which frankly is not going to happen. So if the state does lose the Supreme Court case, the legislature, if they want to comply with the ruling, will be forced to increase, in my opinion, most likely income taxes. A lot of the discussion in the media centers around the pass-through exemption that the legislature passed several years ago. And most of you are familiar with it because you're small business owners. The pass-through exemption basically says if you are an LLC, a partnership, a subchapter S corporation, even a sole proprietor, and you get your income on Schedule C, E, or F of your tax return, you no longer pay state income taxes on that money. When it gets talked about and discussed in the media, most of the discussion centers around the fact that business owners aren't paying their fair share of taxes. This is why we have all these state revenue problems. When you look at the tax cuts we passed in 2012, it was $1 billion a year worth of income tax cuts. The pass-through exemption, this small business tax relief provision, accounted for $200 million of that, 20%. 80% of the tax cuts that year were actually cuts in the individual income tax rates. We took our top rate down from 6.45 to 4.6%, where it's going to stay for a while. So if you want to talk about, if we have to raise income taxes to pay for future state spending, when you talk about in the context of raising another $600 million for K through 12 education, in my opinion, the first thing to go would probably be the pass-through exemption. Even if you did that, that's $200 million. We're still going to have to come up with another $400 million. A $400 million tax increase could take various forms. Most likely it would be about a 1.5% increase in our income tax rate. So we would take the 4.6 we're at now, and it would probably have to go back up to about 6 to 6.1% if we were going to finance a ruling of that size, if we had to come up with that amount of money. If we were going to raise sales taxes, we would have to raise sales taxes about 1%, which would actually take our sales tax rate to the highest rate in the nation. So there are no easy choices. Another option that's been floated that we particularly don't like is right now on every single person's property tax bill, the first 21.5 mils of your property tax bill go to the state to finance public education. That money is then redistributed to school districts across the state. Another proposal would be to double the 20 mils to 40. So instead of paying 20 mils on your property tax bill for public education, you'd be paying 40. So there are no easy options. We're going to be watching those issues as the year progresses. At this point, we do not anticipate the Supreme Court will issue a ruling on the bigger question prior to the end of the session. We think they're going to wait. There's another piece that basically says there's an adequacy piece, which is the $600 million piece, and there's an equity piece. The equity piece basically says if I'm Blue Valley Schools in Overland Park, it's the wealthiest school district in the state, and I raise a mill under my local option budget, my local support for schools, it raises almost 200 times what a mill increase in Southwest Kansas raises. So our formula basically says when a wealthier school district raises property taxes, the state then has to provide funding to the other less wealthy school districts to equalize education, because every student deserves the same education as other students that live in other districts. So anytime a local school district raises property taxes, the state has to take income and sales tax revenue the state has collected and give it to school districts to equalize that money. There's a formula that calculates how all that is done. The school districts that have sued the state are also saying the state has underfunded that formula by about $80 million a year. I do think it is likely that the state loses that piece of the case, and I do think it is very likely we have to come up with that money this session. So we'll see what happens with that. There's some talk that ruling may come down in April. So that'll throw kind of a late wrench into the budget discussions, but that's another moving piece. But this year, in contrast to last year when we had a 114-day session and it lasted into late June, we do anticipate that this session will end early. My prediction right now is we're going to have a 75 to 80-day session. Under the Constitution, under statute, the legislature meets for 90 days every year. They want to finish early, and my guess is right now we're going to finish early. We're probably going to finish in 75 to 80 days. The budget is pretty close to where everybody wants it. The fund transfers are a lot more popular than tax increases, and they're a lot more popular than budget cuts. So even though it's an accounting gimmick, I think it's going to pass, and I think the budget discussion will actually go fairly quickly this year. We have a few somewhat major items on the agenda. The biggest one of which, as you probably heard a lot about, is the public vote requirement. Alternatively, it's called the property tax lid by those who don't like it. And basically what it is, just to take you back into 1908, Republican Governor Edward Hoke in 1908 proposed the first version of the property tax lid. And what it is, it's essentially a limitation on how much property taxes can grow. It's been in effect at various times since 1908. Most of the time in the past, it's been supported by Democratic governors. Bob Docking was a big supporter of it. Joan Finney was a big supporter of it. In 1999, a group of cities and counties came to the state and had it repealed. So prior to that time, if I was a city or county and I wanted to raise property taxes by more than the rate of inflation, I could not do that unless the voters allowed me to do that. Unless there was an election and the voters said, yes, you can raise property taxes by this amount. In 1999, Johnson County basically led the effort. A big group of cities and counties came to the legislature, and they had that requirement repealed. So since that time, there has been no public vote requirement. What's happened since that time? In 97 and 98, property taxes grew by about 1 to 1.5% a year over the previous year. The first year the public vote requirement was repealed in 1999, property taxes grew by 10%. The next year they grew by 9%, the next year they grew by 8%. Every year thereafter they've been growing by an average of 7% a year. So every year, without fail, property tax revenues mostly in Kansas go up 7% a year. In perspective, our population is growing less than 0.5% a year. Inflation is going up about 1.5% a year, which totals 2% a year. So our property taxes in Kansas are growing at 3 times the rate of inflation. They're growing at 14 times the rate of our population, and they're growing at about actually 4 times the rate of inflation. So we have a problem in our opinion. You cannot sustain that rate of growth over the time period. You'll eventually have less people paying higher taxes. When what we want is we want more people paying the same or lower taxes. That's how you create economic growth. So we're obviously pushing that requirement to go back into place. Last session we passed a bill at the very end of the session as part of the final tax passage that basically says if cities and counties want to raise property taxes, they can only do so if the public votes. The problem was the legislature made that bill effective in 2018. It does not go into effect until January 1st of 2018, which means cities and counties have 3 budget years before they have to comply with it. Now, if somebody told you 3 years from now they were going to limit how much money you could spend, what do you think you would do for the next 3 years? You would probably spend as much as you could. So what we've seen has happened this year. Johnson County, for example, raised property taxes 14% this year. And one of the reasons for doing so was they knew this requirement was going to go into effect. Russell County, which is a very small county out in western Kansas, they raised their mill levy almost 9 mills. And part of doing so, they said this public vote requirement is going to go into effect in 3 years, and we want to raise our base. So what they're doing is if property taxes are here now, and this public vote requirement is going to go into effect 3 years out from now, the higher I can get my base before it actually starts, the more flexibility I'll have once it's in effect. So we believe that cities and counties over the next 3 years, if we do not move the date up, will intentionally try to build in as much property tax revenue growth as they can. So when the lid actually does go into effect, they'll have a higher base to start from. So we are proposing to move the public vote requirement date up by 2 years. It would go into effect, instead of on January 1st, 2018, it would go into effect on July 1st, 2016, which means starting this budget year, as your cities and counties put together their 2017 budgets, basically they would not be allowed to raise property taxes over the rate of inflation, which this year is going to be about 2 to 2.5%, unless they had the public vote to approve that increase. So the typical argument from the cities and counties has been, this is not going to allow us to create growth. We're not going to be able to build new infrastructure. This is going to restrict us on what we can do. It's going to harm quality of life. The reason we think that argument is incorrect is we have built in 14 different exemptions to the law. And they're mostly things that relate to real estate growth and development, which ideally is what we want. Number one, any property that is newly constructed doesn't count towards the calculation of whether property tax revenues went up. So if I come into Topeka, Kansas, and I build a huge new $10 million manufacturing facility, the commercial property tax revenues that come into Douglas County or to Shawnee County and the city of Topeka because of that development don't count towards this formula on whether or not property tax revenues have increased. So new construction never counts.
Is that strictly commercial?
No, it's everything. Every class of property: agriculture, residential, commercial, every single particular class of property. And what that does is, we think, that gives cities and counties an incentive to grow. If you do want to grow your property tax base, if you want to have a growth of revenues in your community, you're going to aggressively go after growth. The other thing that doesn't count is special assessments. So if I'm a developer, I'm putting in a new subdivision outside of Topeka, I need the city or county to bring sewer and water and roads out to that subdivision. If the county and city do special assessments on that property, the revenues required to pay off those bonds, principal and interest, do not count towards this requirement. So we continue to allow cities and counties to do special assessments. If I want the city of Topeka to do a tax increment financing district or some type of incentive district or some type of abatement, the bonds that are issued by the city to pay off that district, to pay off that incentive, that abatement, also do not count, the bond and interest payments. So we've accommodated that. If I own $1 million commercial building downtown, or a home, per se, let's be a giant home, and I improve that property. Let's say I take $1 million office building downtown, I put in a significant amount of money into renovations. Next year it's worth $2 million. That also doesn't count. That's an improvement to property. When you improve your property, you knew you're going to improve its value. The only thing our public vote requirement focuses on is the amount of property tax revenues that come into a city or county because of the growth of valuations on existing properties that were already on the tax rolls. So what we're trying to do is protect you when you make an investment in the city of Topeka or Shawnee County, you buy a property, it protects you from having your property tax revenues or the amount of property taxes you pay skyrocket over time, because it makes sure the city and the county cannot raise property tax revenues overall just because your property is getting more valuable over time. So it basically says just because assessed valuations in my community went up 10% this year doesn't necessarily mean the city and county have to raise spending by 10%. Our argument is it would be better if you reduced the mill levy rate by a certain amount, so you gave a break to existing property owners. Let's use the growth of valuations, let's use that to actually bring the mill levy rate down for other property owners. So if assessed valuations in let's say in Johnson County, because they've been going up about 8 to 9% a year, if assessed valuations go up in Johnson County 9% in a given year, and our requirement says they can't raise property taxes more than 2.5%, they're going to have to use that 6.5% extra. And they're either going to have to go to the public and say, will you allow us to increase property taxes by this amount? Or they're going to have to reduce mill levy rates on everybody else, so their total property tax revenues grow by less than 2.5%. That's as simple as it is, and what we think it'll do over time is it will force cities and counties to lower mill levy rates. They'll actually give existing property owners a break. We will use the revenues created by growth, created by increased valuations, to lower mill levy rates and give people a break. They'll still be allowed to accommodate for growth because of all these exceptions we put into the law. It will just limit the growth of property tax revenues from assessed valuation increases. So
how is that battle going?
I think we're going to win. So right now the bill's in place. There's 14 exemptions. It goes into effect on January 1st, 2018. So the worst case scenario for us is it goes into effect as scheduled in 2018. We have a bill this year to move it up to July 1st of 2016. There's a lot of support for it. Leadership in both houses support it. The governor endorsed it in his State of the State speech last night, made it one of the major priorities of this year for him. We did some polling at the end of last session. They are the highest poll numbers I've ever seen. Not surprisingly, when you ask somebody, hey, do you want to vote on whether your property taxes go up? I joked with a legislator yesterday, it's about as popular as asking people, do you like puppies? There's about 80% of people, yeah, I like puppies. 20% of people are like, I'd rather have cats. So we ask voters, do you support the right to vote on your property taxes? If a city or county chooses to increase property taxes by more than the rate of inflation, do you support or oppose having the right to vote on that increase before it goes into effect? 76% of voters said yes. 17% said no. When we break that down by demographics, by party, by people who identify as Republicans, Independents, or Democrats, 84% of Republicans said yes, they support it. 78% of Independents, and I think 61% of self-identified Democrats. So pretty much very supermajority strong support across party lines. Especially when you look in terms of intensity. We ask people, do you strongly support it, kind of moderately support it, moderately oppose it, or strongly oppose it? 50% said we strongly support it. 7% said we strongly oppose it. So that's 7 times the number of people strongly support it than strongly oppose it. I've never seen numbers that high. Even when we did polling on our mortgage interest deduction campaign, when the governor tried to get rid of that 3 or 4 years ago, our poll numbers were about 64, 65%. So this issue is even more popular than that was, to protect the mortgage interest deduction. We asked voters, do you want to move it up 2 years, or would you rather have it go into effect in 2018? 66% said yes, move it up 2 years, 2/3 of voters. So very strong support, pretty much across party lines. It's extremely popular. So we anticipate we have a very good chance.
Luke, what's the effort on the other side?
The other side, you have cities and counties. Cities and counties, there are 105 counties. There are almost 1,000 cities. They have a multitude of lobbyists that represent them. Any entity that receives taxpayer funding will oppose the bill. So you have chambers of commerce, most likely. A lot of people don't know your local chambers probably get about half their budget from their city and county. You have health departments, sheriff's departments, county elected officials. Anybody who gets money from a local government entity is voicing objections to the bill because they think they've been told that over time it could reduce the amount of funding that comes to them. So there is opposition in a legislature that has an overwhelming number of what I would consider people that don't like taxes. You know, an overwhelming number of fairly conservative folks who are kind of anti-tax. I don't think those arguments are going to make much headway. What happens right now is a good example. We have a senator in Northwest Kansas that has basically 20 counties in his district. He's got 5 county commissioners per county. So right now he's got 100 people calling him being very angry about this. We are doing a public awareness campaign that will start on February 1st. We're going to have radio ads across the state, digital ads. We're going to have a lot of grassroots outreach. We're going to be having a lot of consumers emailing their legislators about this issue. So by the end of the day, I think the number of people that are supporting this as opposed to opposing it, it's going to be about 20 to 1. But for now, they're hearing from city and county commissioners. So on the Senate, we're starting the bill on the Senate side. I anticipate we'll probably get that started early next month with hearings. I think it'll pass very quickly. It'll pass with about 3/4 of the votes of the Senate. We anticipate a bipartisan vote. We'll probably have 2 or 3 Democrats as well as most Republicans. And then we'll go over to the House, and I think this issue will probably get resolved probably sometime in late March. I would anticipate this is a bill that passes fairly early in the session. When you're running for re-election and you're a House or Senate member and somebody shows you a poll that says 80% of your constituents support this bill, it makes it a little easier for you to support it. So the other issues we have kind of go along the same lines. There's a couple of kind of new interesting ones. One that's come up where I live in the city of Lawrence, not surprisingly. It's very common in other states, in mostly kind of more liberal states. California, Maryland, a few others like that. You have this program that's called inclusionary zoning. And inclusionary zoning kind of sounds like this nice little warm, fuzzy thing. You know, it's something we can all get behind. We want to include people. What it really means is it's price controls on housing. So what happens is in those areas, if I'm in California and I'm a developer and I buy a piece of property adjacent to a city, it's zoned for single family residential, it's got infrastructure, it's ready to go, it's ready to be platted. I'm the developer, I come into that neighborhood, I say, here's my plat, I want to build some homes. The city says, well, we love it that you're following the land use plan, that's fine, and your plan meets zoning, but we want you to set aside 30% of your units in your subdivision, and you can only sell those to people that make less than 60% of area median income. Doesn't matter if the price point in your subdivision is 150, 250, 450, 650. It's one size fits all. It says if you're building a new subdivision in our community, 30% of your units have to have price controls on them. So when you look at the cities that have actually done this and you read the research, every developer has to get construction financing from their bank. They got to pay their subs. Their margins aren't fantastic. This is not a wildly profitable business. So what happens is the developer has to recoup that money. They're not doing this for free. They have people to pay. They have bank loans to pay off. So the 30% of the units that are price controlled, the developer is forced to take whatever they've had to lose on those units, and they raise the prices on the other 70% of the units in the development. Let's hope the appraised values hold out and they can actually sell those for what they're raising the price to. The one city that's kind of comparable to us that has done it is Madison, Wisconsin. It's another university state capital town. They did it they started this program in 2006. You guys will remember 2006, it was the boom years. Things were great in 2006. Things were expanding rapidly. We were very happy in 2006. They passed it in 2006. In 2007, the first year after they passed it, they had a 68% reduction in the number of housing units that were built in Madison. What developers basically said is, I'm going to take my ball and I'm going to go play elsewhere. This is not going to work for my business. This is not fair. And I'm going to go somewhere else and build my homes. So they went to the suburbs. They went to the surrounding communities and built. So that happens everywhere. What you see is a decrease in supply. And anytime you have a decrease in supply, what you see is an increase in cost. So what it does is it hurts the very people it was supposed to help. It leads to unaffordability. It leads to higher prices. So we're going to the legislature this year And we're basically saying those types of programs can't be done in Kansas. It's basically a price control. You're basically setting an artificial limit on what somebody can sell their home for, or what somebody can rent their home for. Generally what we've seen, and if this has happened in Lawrence already once, what happens most of the time, what they're really interested in, the city will actually say, well, if you don't want to set aside 30% of the units, that's okay. You can just pay us $500,000. And we'll take that money and we'll put it into an affordable housing trust fund. So what it's really used for is to generate funding for various city programs. So we're opposed to it. The Home Builders Association is opposed to it because the last thing we want to see in Kansas is a lower supply of homes and drastically, we'd love to see somewhat higher prices, but we don't want to see drastically higher prices that risk affordability. So that's a new issue that's kind of popped up this year that we're going to go ahead and preempt, and we're going to take that off the table so cities and counties can't do that. And the final issue we have, we actually have a pretty big debate going on about commercial property taxes. Like I said, we are either the worst or the 9th worst in the nation when you look at commercial property taxes. We think there are some fairly unfair things that county appraisers do when they value commercial properties. Just a few examples. We had a member 7 or 8 years ago in Wichita that owned an apartment complex. He got his tax statement from the county, like you do every year. He thought it was grossly overvalued. He took it all the way to the Court of Tax Appeals. It took him 3 years. He spent about $40,000 in attorney fees. He won. So he's like, well, this is amazing. I won. You know, this issue is solved. The very next year, the county sent out his valuation notice, and it was right back where it was. He called the county appraiser and he said, what's going on here? I just won my court case. Why are you raising my value? And they said, well, that was only for 1 year. So he said, we disagree with the court case. We think your property is worth more, so we're going to raise it right back where it was. So he had to, again, go through the entire process. Another 3 years, another $40,000, just to basically win a court case he'd already won. So we passed legislation a few years ago that basically said counties can't do that anymore. Every time you protest your property valuation and you win, you get what we call a 2-year safe harbor, which basically says the county cannot increase your property's valuation for 2 years. The counties have sued the state of Kansas over that provision. They don't like that provision. So we're going to be disputing that again in the legislature this year and defending that. Some other examples are we had a fairly large commercial developer that bought a big piece of ground in Johnson County, basically an old dilapidated shopping mall. They thought it was worth about $9 million. They bought the property for about $9.5 million bucks. They bought the property, the sale closed on January 3rd. Your property is supposed to be appraised as of January 1st. Well, lo and behold, the county appraiser found out about the sale that happened on January 3rd. They sent out a revised valuation notice basically saying the property was worth $14 million. And the developer's like, well, I bought the thing for 9.5. And they're like, well, because you bought it, and because of your name, because of your standing in the development community, the value has risen because we know it's going to be a popular development. So those are the types of things that happen. Another good example is you have a strip mall. It's got a strip mall, it's got various buildings, it's got a parking lot, and because it had some stormwater issues, it has a detention pond in the back of it. The detention ponds are normally on a separate piece of property. You normally have the shopping center and the parking lots on one piece of property, and you have the detention pond on a separate piece of property. That property is worthless. From a property tax standpoint, from a use value standpoint, you can't do anything with a detention pond other than fish on it. It's there to catch stormwater, and it looks nice. So when the county appraiser comes by to assess that property is worthless. But what they do is they use what's called an economic unit analysis. And they actually take that property and they merge it with the other property so they can give it a value. So we have a bill, part of our bill prevents that from happening. You have a situation where you have, these are real examples. You have a situation where you have a taxpayer, it's the Nebraska Furniture Mart case from a few years ago. They thought their building was worth like $11 million. The county came in and said it was worth about $50 million. They appealed that valuation, but the county says you have to give us that money. You can only appeal it under protest. So Nebraska Furniture Mart was forced to chip over the entire portion of that money, even though that they thought the property was grossly overvalued. Lo and behold, Wyandotte County spent that money. They didn't keep it. They didn't hold it in reserve. And when they went to the Board of Tax Appeals to have that case, Wyandotte County says, well, you can't agree with them. We've already spent the money. We don't have it. So if they win their case, we have nothing to give them. We can't refund that money. So we have another bill that basically says if I'm a taxpayer and I protest the county's valuation, I still have to pay under protest, but the county actually has to put that money in a separate fund and they can't spend it. They can't spend the money until my protest has been resolved. So that basically safeguards if I win the case, they're actually going to be able to pay me the money they owe me. And what we think will happen is, what happens generally in a property tax appeals case is the counties drag it out as long as it can possibly last, which is why they take about 3 years. If I have that money sitting in a separate account and they can't use it, what we think is there's going to be a little bit higher incentive for them to negotiate and come to a settlement before they actually get to the Board of Tax Appeals. So those are just kind of some issues that you don't really think about every day. They're all coming together in one. In that bill, we have 14 different issues like that. We're basically, in my opinion, trying to make it more fair for property taxpayers to protest their value and basically to get a fair treatment.
Does that particular bill have a name?
Not yet. It doesn't have a number. It's being drafted. We think it's going to be about 100 to 125 page bill. I mean, it's huge. So we don't anticipate that bill being ready until the end of the month. We think it'll finally be ready. So those are kind of the big issues we're facing. If you guys have questions on other issues, the good thing is you do have Laura Kelly coming in a couple weeks from now. She's a very, very knowledgeable legislator. She's on the Ways and Means Committee, so she knows 10 times more than I know about the budget. So she will be able to answer some really good detailed questions for you on the budget and what's going on. But if you have other questions on our issues, any other state issues, this is kind of a great time for us to kind of have a dialogue about those and kind of see what you guys have.
I have one. The percentage of the total budget that goes to education is astounding. Is that typical across the country?
We're somewhat higher than most. Different states finance their education systems in different ways. We all roughly get the same amount of federal education funding. Some states provide local school districts with sales tax authority. Some give them income tax authority. Some give them greater property tax authority than we do. We are a state that predominantly finances education through the state. We do allow our local school districts to raise property taxes. They have a local option budget. The local option budget basically says, take the total amount of funding I'm getting from the state. It's just base state aid per pupil number that you hear about in the media a lot. And I can raise 33% of that per student with local property taxes, and no more than that, if my voters let me do it. They have to vote on it, the voters have to approve it. Other states don't have that same system. They may have higher levels of property tax support. It's really hard to do an apples to oranges comparison across state lines because our systems are so completely different. When you look at what we actually spend per student, it's about $13,000 a year on average per student. The base state aid per pupil number that gets reported in the media is, we always joke at the Capitol, there's only one person alive who can actually understand our school finance formula. It's a guy named Dale Dennis. He's the Deputy Secretary of Education. And the joke is that once Dale's gone, then we're screwed because no one knows how to understand it. But you basically, every student is not, the easiest way, it doesn't sound right, every student is not one student. There are multipliers built into the formula. So the base state aid per pupil number is the base number. And I can't remember what the exact amount this year, it's like 4,900 or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But then if you have a student that lives more than 2 miles away from the school, you multiply it by 1 point something. If you have a student that has free or reduced price lunches, that they're called an at-risk student, you multiply it by something else. If you have a student that's English as a second language, you multiply it by something else. If you have districts with low valuations, with not a lot of property values, they get a multiplier. There's a weighting for that. There's a weighting if you build new schools. So by the time it all comes to it, this $4,900 turns into about $13,100. So depending upon who you ask, and they're both right, we're either cutting education or we're increasing education. So there are two ways to answer the question, and they're both right. Base state aid per pupil has been cut. It has not been growing by what we promised. It has not been keeping up with inflation. Total top-end funding per student has grown. It has increased. It is exceeding inflation. But it's used differently. It's kind of siloed into different things. The biggest disagreement you see in the media is how do you count capers? So a few years ago, I think in the 90s or the 80s, the school districts were absorbed into capers. Prior to that time, they had their own retirement system. Since that time, teachers have been part of the state employee pool for retirement purposes. They have a separate pool, but they're all part of the same program. And the state pays for the capers for teachers. So this last year, because of capers, when we came in about 8 to 9 years ago, capers was the second most underfunded pension plan in the nation, behind Illinois. If everybody who was eligible for retirement had retired on that day and requested all of the benefits that were owed to them, we would have been about 40% short of being able to pay those benefits. Our unfunded measure is up significantly. Our funded measure, we've made some progress there. But this year's school finance formula, we had to increase significantly the amount of money that was going to pay teacher pensions. So when you talk to a lot of education advocates, they're like, well, that doesn't count because that doesn't go to the classroom. It doesn't pay for supplies. It doesn't pay for electricity. It goes to teacher pensions, which they're not going to claim until they retire. On the other side of the debate, both of them have merit. They say, well, if I don't give your teachers pensions, how likely are they to show up to work the next day? If you tell them you're working without retirement, without a retirement plan. So there's multiple arguments. Both of them are right, depending upon your perspective. So that's kind of the big debate you see over education.
Is that based on the number of children enrolled, or how do they get the number?
Yeah, it's basically, so your base state aid per pupil, like I said, it starts with the number, with your head counts. I can't remember the date of the year. There's a date of the year a few weeks after school starts, where schools basically take a head count of the attendance. So every pupil who was in school as of that date and enrolled, for the school finance formula, that's the number that's used to calculate how much money you get. So then that's the base state aid per pupil, but then based upon the individual characteristics of those students, then it applies your weightings. So if you're a district that has more than the average number of at-risk students, students living in poverty, free or reduced price lunches, you'll get more money for educating those students, because the argument is they require more resources. They don't have the support at home that other students might have. So it varies based upon how much poverty you have in your district, how many people live outside the district and have to be bussed in. It just depends on how much money you get under the formula. It's very variable.
So you can't really compare that across state line either?
You can't, because it's pretty much the individual characteristics of the students. So what the legislature did last year that was pretty controversial was the block grant bill. The schools did not like it. Teachers didn't like it. A lot of people didn't like it. Some people did, which basically said because the issue was 2 years ago, you remember, we lost this same court case, and the Supreme Court said you have to pump more money in education. The legislature passed a bill, pumped in what they thought was a good enough amount, but because of the way the formula is drawn and because of how confusing it is, because a lot more school districts took advantage of some school construction incentives than they thought would. Anytime a local school district passes a bond issue, the state pays part of it. And more school districts built new buildings than the state anticipated. So they owed more money than they thought they were going to. So the plan they passed that they thought they passed, they did not put enough money into it. They came back at the start of the very next session, and the Department of Education told them, you're $60 million short. And that was at the time of a $400 million deficit. So $60 million was quite a bit of money. So the legislature and the governor basically said, we're tired of this not knowing anybody not knowing what the formula says and the unpredictability of it. So their solution to it, which again, a lot of people didn't like, was it's called a block grant. It basically says, if I'm USD 501, Topeka Public Schools, the amount of money I gave you today is the amount of money you're going to get for the next 2 years. It's not going to change. The formula is gone. We're going to give you this money and you get to decide how to spend it. So there's no more, you have to spend it on this program, and this program. It's basically the state says, we're going to give you this amount of money and then you get to decide how to spend it, but it's not going to grow. The principal kind of criticism I've heard of that is for school districts that are growing fairly rapidly. I know Olathe has been a big one. I know probably some of your Washburn Rural, Shawnee Heights, some of your districts that are growing pretty fast around Topeka. The criticism I've heard is that when new students move into the district now, they don't get additional funding. because the head counts were the money was essentially frozen as of that date. So if a school district has a large amount of growth and a lot of new students come in, they don't get more funding under the block grant system. And the legislature's response to that is, yeah, we understand that, but we did this so we'd have consistency every year in how much we're spending, and we wouldn't have to come back and keep spending more money each year. So again, there's two sides to that argument. And thankfully, as a realtor association, we don't take sides on that argument. There are groups on both sides that are very capable of having that debate. And unless they're raising property taxes, we generally stay out of it. Any other questions? All right, that's kind of that's like I said, a very high level overview, kind of 50,000 feet of what we're looking at. We'll be in touch later in the session. We'll give weekly updates to Linda. A lot of times she redistributes those to the membership. You can always call me, email me if you have questions. We'll get right back to you, anything you see pop up. And it's great that you'll hear from a lot of legislators later in the session, because they'll give you really valuable information. And they'll give you their perspective, and their perspective is always different than some others, so it's always good to hear a multitude of perspectives, and everybody looks at issues in different ways. So,
Are they hoping for a Kansan to win the lottery?
I want to. I would volunteer to be that candidate. Yeah. It's up to, what, 1.6 billion. So I think the winner, if you choose cash, I think you get 980 million. Then you have to pay a 35% federal tax and a 5% state
I
tax.
know, but that was still like over 40 million or something like
Yeah,
that.
that was actually when it was only worth about.
1.1 billion.
So if God willing, a Kansas resident wins the lottery, the state, I think, will get between 50 and 60 million.
Right.
So that would solve the budget deficit.
Sure
And I'm sure I will step forward. And I will be
I'll be more than
willing to
happy
be
to
that
take that
person.
punishment.
Yeah.
Sacrificial lamb.
Yeah, I'd even be willing to give him an extra 10 million. You know, All right, thank you.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.
Better chance of having it.